When we think about our gadgets, we usually judge them on how well they work, how fast they are, what features they have. But there's this whole other layer, right? It's all about how they make us feel. Today, we're going to dive into that connection between the science of our emotions and the way our everyday tech is actually designed. I mean, just think about your phone for a second. That smooth, satisfying swipe, the little ping you get with a new message, or even that surge of frustration when an app just hangs. See, those aren't just technical glitches or features. They're genuine emotional moments. And we're going to unpack how designers are now building these feelings on purpose. So here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll get into the science of what feelings even are. Then we'll look at the big, juicy questions that researchers are trying to answer. After that, we'll switch gears to design, check out a really cool framework for making emotional products, and finally, we'll take a peek into the future, tech that can actually read our emotions. Okay, so if we're going to design for emotion, we've got to start with, well, what is it? Let's get into the science behind our feelings. So there's this whole field called affective science. It's basically the massive scientific effort to figure out our emotional lives. You've got pioneers like Paul Ekman and Richard Davidson trying to map out the entire ecosystem of our feelings, from moods to preferences to emotional disorders. The goal is to build a real model of how we feel, and more importantly, why. But here's the thing. This science is anything but settled. Affective science is a super dynamic field, and it's full of these huge foundational questions that researchers are still hashing out right now. And this brings us to one of the biggest debates of all. When you feel angry, is that its own unique thing, like a primary color, or is it more like a point on a map, something you define with coordinates, like super unpleasant and really high energy? Okay, so there are basically two big camps here. The discrete states view says we're born with a set of basic, fundamental emotions. Think of it as an emotional toolkit. But the dimensional approach argues it's way more of a spectrum. For a designer, both of these ideas are actually super useful. The dimensional view can help with subtle things like the warmth of a color, while the discrete view is great for choosing clear feedback, like those reaction emojis we all use. And yet, the questions just keep coming. Researchers are digging into everything. Like, what's the actual point of emotions? Are they universal across all cultures? What's the real difference between a bad mood and, say, the emotion of sadness? And how much control do we really have over how we feel? It's a huge, fascinating area. Okay, so that's the science, which is pretty complex, right? The big question for us is, how do we take all this and actually use it to build better stuff? This is where we make the jump into the world of design. And answering that is really the heart of the matter for anyone in human-computer interaction or affective design. It's all about translating these big, abstract ideas about feelings into things you can actually see and touch, features, interfaces, and experiences. This really signals a huge shift in how we think about design. For years, the main goal of human-computer interaction, or HCI, was just efficiency. Could you do the task? Could you do it fast without messing up? But now, that's not enough. The goal isn't just to make something that works, but to make something that connects with you, that makes you feel happy or confident, or even just calm. I mean, just look at the thermostat. The old school ones were just functional boxes on the wall. But then you have something like the Nest. It's beautiful, it's minimalist, and it's actually satisfying to use. It doesn't just change the temperature. It's an object designed to be a pleasant part of your home. That, right there, is emotional design in a nutshell. So how do designers actually do this? How do you go from a boring box to something like the Nest? Well, you need a roadmap. And one of the most famous ones comes from the design guru Don Norman. He suggested that we experience products on 3 totally different levels. So Norman breaks it down into 3 levels. It's super useful. First up is visceral. That's your gut reaction, the first impression. Does it look cool? Does it feel nice? Then there's behavioral, which is all about how easy and enjoyable it is to use. This is your classic usability. And finally, the highest level is reflective. This is where you think about what the product means to you, the story it tells about who you are. All right, let's make this super concrete. Remember the Swatch watch? It was a total design phenomenon back in the day, and Norman's 3 levels explain exactly why it works so well. Okay, let's break it down. The visceral part, that's a no-brainer. The bright colors, the crazy designs, you just couldn't ignore them. On the behavioral level, it was a good watch. It told time accurately, it did its job. But the real magic, that was at the reflective level. A Swatch wasn't just for telling time. It was a fashion statement. It was a piece of your identity on your wrist. The best emotional designs, they hit all 3 of these levels. All right, so far, we've been talking about how we design things to make us feel something. But what happens when the tables turn? What happens when the tech starts to read our emotions? This, my friends, is where things get really interesting. Well, that's where this field called affective computing comes in. The whole point is to give computers some form of emotional intelligence. The idea is to use things like cameras, mics, and sensors to recognize how we're feeling, to know if we're happy or frustrated just by looking at our facial expressions, listening to our tone of voice, or even checking our heart rate. And if you look at something like Plutchik's Wheel of Emotions, you get a sense of just how complex this is. It's not just about happy or sad. It's about all these nuanced feelings like serenity or annoyance or anticipation. The big dream of emotional AI is to be able to read this incredibly rich tapestry of feelings from our digital footprints. So, how in the world does this actually work? Well, AI models are trained on gigantic sets of data, learning to connect physical cues with emotional labels. A camera might track the corners of your mouth to spot a smile, or see a furrowed brow and guess that you're angry. And the end game here is to create systems that adapt. Imagine a learning app that offers you help because it senses you're getting frustrated. That's the goal. And this is why it's such a potential game changer. Our emotional state literally changes the way we think. Research shows that when we're happy, we're more creative, we're more forgiving of little mistakes. When we're anxious, our focus narrows down. Now, if a system knows your emotional state, it could theoretically change its entire interface to match how your brain is working in that exact moment. That's huge. Whew, okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the basic science of our feelings all the way to the future of emotionally aware AI. Let's boil it all down. So if you remember anything, remember these three things. First, it all starts with affective science, that complex, always changing foundation for what emotion even is. Second, emotional design is what takes tech from being just functional to being truly meaningful by working on those visceral, behavioral, and reflective levels. And finally, the future is adaptive. We're building systems that don't just create feelings, but can actually read and react to them. And that leaves us with a really big, kind of provocative question to chew on. As we build all this technology that's more and more tuned in to our inner emotional worlds, we're opening up some amazing possibilities for more helpful, more empathetic tech. But we're also raising some really deep questions about privacy, about manipulation, and about our own autonomy. When our devices know how we feel, maybe even better than we do, who's really in control? That's definitely something we all need to be thinking about.